Good morning. I don't think we can fit anybody else in, so I think we might as well start right on time. My name is Theron Dunn, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to our 7th Nantucket Book Festival. On behalf of the entire committee, we're very glad you're here. Thank you so much for coming year after year. We continue to present this festival because you continue to come. Otherwise, we would definitely not do it. Very, very special thanks are due to our premier sponsors, the White Elephant and the Nantucket Athenaeum, both of whom are well represented here today, and to our many sponsors and donors. And please do look at the back of your program because we value them all very much. They make it possible for most of our events here to be free and open to the members of our community and to our visitors. The year-round work that our book festival does, our book foundation rather, does in the school and for the festival is only possible because of our friends who support us and who come to our events. After Claire Messud and Alice Hoffman's presentation, they will be signing books which will be for sale just right to my right. Please silence your cell phones now, and we will tell you just a little bit about our next speakers. Claire Messud is a woman of influence. She is a sought-after teacher of creative writing. She is a noted critic of literary works, a winner of prestigious awards, and an author of beautifully crafted novels about people, often women, who find themselves dealing with matters of dire consequences in situations that are evocative of places that many of us find ourselves in. She tells her stories in a way that wakes us up with their brilliance and imagination. How did she come up with these ideas and yet somehow bring us back to feelings and experiences that we have had? Reading her latest novel, The Burning Girl, I found myself wishing that I had read it at the age of her characters, which is that of a young adult, and thinking, could this book be for young adults? And yet valuing it from the adult perspective, the age of a parent, thinking along with her child as these young women went through these experiences. It is a story so well told from the heads and hearts of young people that we're taken back to that time in our lives. That is the artfulness of a truly great storyteller. Few of you here in this hall need to be told who Alice Hoffman is. Familiar though she may be, one of our anchors of our festival as friend, advisor, and to our great benefit, frequent presenter here in this hall, it is well that we remember that Alice is not to be taken for granted, and we do not. Her new novel, The Rules of Magic, is prequel to Practical Magic, one of the most loved of Alice's over 40 books. They include novels for adults, but also novels for young adults, books for children, nonfiction books. As you will see, Alice has abundant surprises for all of us. Sitting down for this conversation with Alice and Claire today is Kate Brosnan, another member of the festival family. She is our board member, our advisor, and Kate's real job is executive director and founder of the Nantucket Project, responsible for bringing some of the greatest thinkers of our time to Nantucket, as I'm sure many of you know. And now join me in welcoming Claire, Alice, and Kate.
Are these on? Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be in this beautiful room with two of my favorite writers. I thought I would start because I love this process of going back and I love both of these new books that you've written, but I also love this process of how to discover more about you, and I always find it in some quotes. Alice knows this. We did this last year. Claire, your quote that I picked out is, and I think it's from your last book, life is about deciding what matters. It's about fantasy that determines the reality. Have you ever asked yourself whether you'd rather fly or be invisible? I was like, And maybe we'll start right there. Tell me about that quote, and would you rather fly or be invisible?
I'd rather fly.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd rather fly, but I think people have a pretty immediate. I mean, there are some people who say, can't I have both?
That would be me.
Right, but if you have to choose just one, I think people really come down pretty quickly on one side or the other, and it is a matter of temperament. I think, you know, as someone who would choose flying, I think of the flying thing as sort of a more childlike choice, and being invisible, which is about having the chance to have more knowledge about everything and everyone, seems in some ways a more adult choice. That seems too scary to me. I wouldn't want that.
Alice?
It's so interesting because I immediately would choose being invisible.
I knew you were going to say that. I knew it.
And the character that I'm writing about right now practices being invisible.
Wow.
But I don't think about it as finding out more information. I think about it as keeping more information to yourself.
Okay. All right. Now for Alice's quote.
We're opposites.
This is, this one, and because I think it goes to especially this last book. I think love is a huge factor in fiction and in real life. Is there a risk? Always. In fiction and in life. Go ahead.
Did I say that?
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Alice Hoffman.
Yeah, I agree with myself. I do.
Yeah. And you take that risk. It really, and so now we're going to talk about the books. I'll start with you. Alice, in this latest prequel, which is, first of all, why did you go back to the story of the Owens family? Because I found that 10 years later, by the way.
20.
Was it 20?
You know, I think.
Whoa.
I know. I think, well, I had readers that were constantly saying, what happens next? And I started to think about that, but I really wanted to know what happened in the past. I'm always much more interested in what happened in the past than what will happen. Right. And also I wanted to write about the 60s, which is my favorite time period and the period I lived through. And I just felt like, the idea that you can never know older people, including your parents, really, because you don't know the way they were when they were young. Your children can't know you because they don't know you the way you were when you were young. They think this is who you are.
Right.
But they're wrong.
Right. They are so wrong. So wrong. And Claire, that goes to your book also in this new book, The Burning Girl, about this interior life of these two young girls, but also that this time in adolescence is a lot like romantic love.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that there's childhood friendships can be like romantic love too. I mean, in my mind, I think of it as the sort of the coming of boundaries into life, and that in childhood, you don't have the same kind of boundaries. Kids play like puppies in a pen, and they don't think about where one ends and the other begins. And then adolescence is that time in which you sort of pause and look up and look around, and you're like, oh, there's a world out there. Or you go to your friend's house, and you think, well, this is weird. So either my house is weird or this house is weird. Like, what's a normal house?
Right.
And you try to put yourself in the context of a broader thing, and that comes in the way of these passionate friendships because you're having to sort of set boundaries, and not everybody always wants to set a boundary.
Right.
Yeah, but certainly I do think it is like first love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when I was reading it, it reminded me of the intensity of the relationships at that point, where we're learning everything about how to be who we are, right? I mean, through our parents, but mostly through our friendships, and then we can get to be who we really are in those intimate early friendships. There's also the idea of spirit and ghosts, Alice, and which is a theme through a lot of your work, and that I was reading, and we talked about this a little bit last night, that I was reading that you had an experience in London where you heard voices out in the hallway fighting every night, same fight, and then they were gone, and you felt that was definitely a spirit experience. And I believe
Maybe.
you. I believe it.
Yeah, I don't know. It felt like that to me. It was a really crummy hotel, and there was no, the door didn't have one of those latches that you could look through. But I did hear the same, it was where they stuck the writers when they came to London. And I did hear the same thing over and over again. And I wrote a book called The Third Angel, which you can read either back in time or forward. So you can read it either from the beginning to the end or the end to the beginning.
That must have been really hard to write.
It was really fun to do because it made me feel like how fluid time is and how we're so affected by the past. I mean, you always feel, well, sitting in this room, but you always feel like the past is kind of with you. You know, you sit down and like all these other experiences are sitting down with you, everything your mother told you and your grandmother told you and the stories that you heard about, you know, relatives. You know, you're carrying all those ghosts with you.
Right. And I love that because somebody had asked you in one of these things I was reading, do you believe in ghosts? And you said, we all have them. It's our past that we drag with us through our lives. I think that made so much sense to me.
May I, it just reminds me, I learned recently about epigenetics. Do you all know about that? About the fact that they discovered that it isn't just our memories, it's the memories of, so they trained, it was about mice and fear. They made, they made an association between the scent of cherry blossoms and fear for mice. And 3 generations later, the mice were still afraid of the scent of cherry blossoms. So I feel as though we do, I mean, it may
Our
or may not be
bodies and our
ghosts,
cells contain the
yeah.
memory.
Absolutely.
That predate our lives.
And
Yeah.
the only thing worse than being a mouse is being a Russian Jew. We carry the fear for generations.
Oh, I knew this was going to be so much fun. I knew it. I did. I knew it. You grew up very much in the world of fairy tale, and your grandmother's stories really had an impact on you. And talk to me a little bit about who she was and how she impacted your life.
Yeah, she was like the one person in my life that I could really depend on. I had a family that you couldn't depend on anybody, and they weren't really there. But she was really there. And it was just so interesting to be with her, you know, be on a bus with her in New York City and have her tell stories about her childhood in Russia. So I always felt like I was in 2 places at once, you know?
Right.
And, you know, like a literary place and a real place. And I still feel that way, you know? So I just
And
felt...
at that age, Alice, was that the beginning, the seeds of, I want to be a storyteller, I want to write this down?
I think then I was just, I want to hear more.
Okay.
You know?
Right. And Claire, I think the interesting part of your ghosts are that you're really the only American in your family.
I am, yeah. Well, no, now I have kids.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's right.
They're Americans
But
too.
your family of origin.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about Australia and your parents and moving and how that impacted you.
Yeah, so my mom was Canadian and my father was French, which makes everybody think that I'm French Canadian, but but I'm not. She was from Toronto, so and we moved around a lot when I was a kid. And my sister, who's older, was born in France, so I was the only one born in the United States. And we lived in Australia and Canada. I was born here, but then we moved briefly to Canada, then to Australia, then back to Canada, then here when I was a teenager. And I do think. You know, there are all sorts of ways in which I think that made me interested in writing and in telling stories. And part of it was having control over something, right? Like you had this imaginary world that was yours. I remember hearing, this is many years ago, I was in Paris and I was young, and Edmund White and Kathy Acker were having a conversation, and Edmund White said he lived in Paris at the time, and he said, I love living in Paris because I feel that English is all mine. I feel like it's my language and I can do what I want with it. And then Kathy Acker said, and I feel exactly the same way. And I thought to myself, you live in London. But anyway, but maybe, you know, she meant American English is all mine. But I think part of it is that thing of feeling that something is yours and your imaginary world is yours. Yeah.
Let's talk about a little bit about the characters in your new books. Alice, Franny, Jet, and Vincent. I actually find Vincent fascinating. Yeah,
Why did you make that face?
Yeah, you didn't like Vincent?
No, I did, but I don't know how much I can say about him because he's kind of a surprise when you read the book. So
Oh, we don't, who's read the book?
Who's read the book? You're gonna
Who
be good.
hasn't read the, oh my God, so we can't blow the surprise?
There's something that, sometimes this happens, is that, and I'm sure Claire has happened to you, you're writing a character, you think you know everything about them, but you don't. And Vincent didn't know something about himself, and I didn't know something, and it came as a huge surprise to me, so it's hard for me to talk about him.
Okay. We'll talk about it later.
Okay.
To me, the theme that kept coming through in your latest book was, and Vincent symbolizes this, is the only way to live really is to be your true self, right? It's the only thing you can be, and Vincent's a great example of that. But so are the sisters, and this idea in Alice's book that if you love, something bad will happen.
Yeah.
This curse that's on the family, that something bad's going to happen.
Right. And that's true. Really, it is true.
I agree.
But I mean, in a larger sense than our own experiences, if you love someone, you can lose them. I mean,
It makes you vulnerable.
It makes you vulnerable, and not only can you can lose them, you will lose them. You will either die or they will die. You will lose them, and that's just the way life is. So loving someone is just a huge step off of a cliff, really.
Right. And yet we're so willing to take it. So are your characters at the cost. And, I would say the risk is worth it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there really is nothing else.
That's right.
What's the point of being human and being
Right.
alive if you
Right.
can't love?
Yeah, I just wish some of those guys didn't have to die, Alice. There were some good guys there in that book.
They died?
Yeah.
Really, I don't remember that.
Wait.
Sometime fairly early on also, so like maybe it's not a spoiler to say some of them die fairly, like one of them at least.
Yeah.
Well, people die, Kate. There's nothing I can do about that.
Let's not get too heavy.
Okay.
Let's talk about Julia and Cassie. Okay, first question is, who are you more like?
Oh, I think I'm more like Julia. I mean,
Oh.
I think so. Just there's Julia's the storyteller, right? And Cassie's the one whose story is. I mean, and I think I've always thought about that in terms of novels like Brideshead Revisited. There's Charles Ryder and Sebastian Flight, and
back to flying.
but also Gatsby.
Right.
That, like I feel as though the person whose story gets told tends to be the acting, the one who has a more vivid acting life as opposed to a reflective, observing life. And the downside of being the reflective, observing one is it's just not as much fun as being the other, or dark though. The tragedy also goes to the actor. But on the other side, you get to tell a story.
And in the book, they go and discover an abandoned hospital, or it was at one point a hospital for women, which was really interesting. And I felt like that was so symbolic of like the untold stories, the hushing up, and they break into it. And so talk to me about a little bit, 'cause Alice, do you remember on Long Island, Pilgrim State? Oh, God. And that there's this huge building that had been shut down, and it always gave me, just even driving by it, had a power to it. Yeah. So, and this is what reminded me in Claire's book. Talk about those untold, the quiet woman that just doesn't have a voice. I felt like that was really symbolic.
Right. Well, in my mind, it's an asylum that they happen upon, and I was thinking about the double meaning of that. Right. That it's both the place you shut people away, and it's the place of refuge at the same time. And you don't really know. Right.
Right.
It's like love. It's the gamble. Like, which is it going to end up being? I think it's almost the question of ghosts again. My interest, I became sort of obsessed with places like that. We spent a year in Germany, in Berlin, and in and around Berlin there are lots of abandoned, very haunted places, including a mental institution in a place called Beilitz, south of Berlin, that's an entire sort of compound that had its own serial killer, actually, at one time. Yeah.
There's a book.
But in Germany you can just wander right in. There's no barbed wire and no trespassers will be prosecuted. But Massachusetts is full of those places too, and I feel like there's so much. There's so much when you walk through such a place or walk by such a place, like you really do feel the ghosts there, and there are so many stories untold that were never told.
Right.
Yeah.
And you wonder what they are, right? Right. You described this book as a children's book for grown-ups. Tell me more about that.
Well, one of the things that then everybody says, like, you mean a YA book? And no, I don't. Actually, I mean like a kid's book for grown-ups. So our kids are teenagers now, and but I read to them for a long time, particularly our son, who's not a huge reader himself, but loved being read to, and it brought back for me that great way as when you're reading, either as being a kid or reading like a kid, you fall into the story, right? You just fall into that. And I have that experience with these books, right? With Alice's books, that you don't ask the question, is this plausible? Like if you think about a Greek myth, right? You don't think, wait a minute. So Zeus falls in love with a maiden, Hera, jealous, turns the maiden into a cow. You're like, wait a minute, people don't turn into cows? I'm not gonna read this, forget about it. No, you're like, oh my God, she turned into a cow, what next, right? And there's something really fabulous about that. And that, I think, that's the magic of, we were talking last night about abracadabra, the words, tell me again, the words. I create what I speak. I create what I speak. And it was, I think it was that feeling that's what I was hoping. Like another way I've said it, I wanted the experience of reading it to be like a slide, sort of slippery, like so that you're not stopping and trying to
Find out where you are in it,
analyze
right.
things. You're just kind of going.
You just go with it.
Yeah.
Magic, Alice, and fantasy, big part of a lot of your writing. Why?
Well, I feel like it's the original literature.
Okay.
So I feel like for me, it's not a leap. For me, the original literature is folk tales, fairy tales, myths, and the stories that grandmothers told to grandchildren. And they're always not always, but they're often cautionary tales. They're kind of a teaching mechanism to teach you about the world in a very emotional, basic state, what about right and wrong. For me, magic and literature always went together. I mean, that's what I read as a kid. I think, realism is kind of a newer variety of writing and storytelling. And I think, the original storytelling always included magic. And I think what Claire said was so interesting about, creating a world, and that's what storytellers do. We want to create a world for you to go into and fall down the rabbit hole and just, believe in this world and accept it and be part of it. Because as the reader, you're creating it too. We were talking about that last night, right? You create the world that you're reading.
Right.
And it's an interesting relationship that I don't think any other art form has, where you're doing this together, really. I mean, my Heathcliff might not be your Heathcliff, but he's
Why the movie always disappoints.
Right, exactly. Always. Alice, you consider yourself, I think, and you're a writer, but you think of yourself as a reader? Is that, do you...
I used to, but not anymore.
Oh, that changed?
It changed for me because
40 books plus, it kind of changes.
It changed and I feel really bad because I was such a voracious reader, but now I feel like I have to make a choice. And especially being on a computer all day and with eyes that are getting older, I can't then sit down and read a gigantic book. So I have to make a choice between my own work and someone else's book. And so it has to get me on the first page, or I just feel like otherwise I could be writing.
And Alice, in your situation, do you feel like a lot of pressure? Because it seems like you churn things out. Is there a sense of pressure that you've put on yourself that is it the flow of how you would choose, or does it feel like, as many of us feel like in our jobs, that we have to?
It's complicated for me, but I do feel pressured, but I've always felt pressured. I mean, I felt pressured to, finish high school in 3 years, finish college in 3 years, finish graduate school. I feel pressured. I feel like there's not enough time.
Okay.
And I think I'm right. There's not enough time.
Here we go again.
Sorry, I know. So I feel like I'll never be able to write all the books. So I've now, at this point, realized that, okay, so I'm never going to be able to write all the books.
Right. How about you, Claire? Is it a joyful experience? Is it a laboring experience? Is it?
It's sort of both. I mean,
Okay.
I think, these days I teach quite a bit. I teach full time in the school year, and so I spend a lot of time lamenting the fact that I don't have time to write. But in a funny way, that means that when I do have time, it feels all the more, for one thing, you don't procrastinate as much, right? But for another, it feels more joyful in a way. I think, I know what you mean about there's never going to be enough time, and I feel that not just in writing, but in a life way now, which I didn't used to. When I think about what would I like back from my youth, what I would like is that feeling. Just that feeling that there's lots of time.
Right.
Just that feeling that you could lie in a field and stare at the sky for the afternoon, and that's you're not.
It's not a waste of time.
Yeah, you're not falling behind on anything
Right.
else, right? Like I don't know if am I going to get that in a little bit? I hope. Am I going to get that again? I'm hoping sometime. But but life is so busy too now in a different way. When you're saying about the computer screens, I feel like we just don't need to turn them off, right? Like that alone would slow everything down. If you just didn't look at the email for 5 days.
And you write with a pad and a pen?
I do, yeah.
Not on the computer?
No, I was a temporary secretary in my youth, and I typed really fast, and on the computer it looks pretty good.
Right.
It's a bad idea.
How important is the editing process, and how involved, is it a constant rewrite, or is it something that, okay, you get the bones down and then go back to, or have other eyes on it? Because I think editing would be, here you have, what do you take out?
I know, it's really hard. For me, it's constant. I'm constantly editing.
Can you put your mic up?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was just talking to you, Kate. Sorry.
There's a couple other people on
Oh,
the
sorry. Excuse me. I'm constantly editing all the time, but I try to do it so that I don't do it too soon, because if I do it too soon, I tend to just throw out the whole project. So you don't want to look at it and think, oh, this is horrible after 5 pages. After 50 pages, you're kind of more like, okay, well, this is fixable, maybe. And so I do a lot of editing, and then I have friends look at it, and then I have an agent look at it, and I'm just constantly editing. And it's hard, because I think a lot of it has to do with cutting your own work. For me, the rules of magic, I would say from the original manuscript, maybe 100 pages exists.
Oh,
Yeah.
that exists.
Exists.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I understand, Claire, that you gave your book to your daughter to read.
Yeah, this one, not everyone, poor
Okay.
thing, yes. But this one, I did give her the manuscript. She's a teenager. She's almost 17, there were just things, because it's about adolescence now, and there were things I wanted, and she did. She said, I would never use that word. I would never say that to a friend, and she.
And you took her advice.
I absolutely took her advice, and it did mean, when people said, I don't believe that any teenager would, I said to her, if you think there's anything that's implausible or that somebody wouldn't think, or that, tell me, and so I made changes, and so when people say, what does Messud at 50 know about teenage life? I'm like, well, I know something, and I had an authentic advisor.
And do you think in that it is different, or how similar is it no matter what generation is? Because it seems to me those are universal feelings of coming of age, right? It doesn't change that much.
Yeah, that was my feeling, was that the emotions are the same. It's like, the emotions haven't, and the intensity of the friendship, just, did I mention last night, there's a Lori Moore has just published a book of essays and criticism, and in that book she's reviewing a book about adolescence, and she closes the review by saying, adolescence is a howling dog. Eventually it is buried, but it is buried alive, which is so, and I feel like it's so true. It's so true. And I feel like watching my daughter and my niece go through that time, I feel like my howling dog came back to, came out of the ground. And it seemed so immediate and so recent and so powerful, the intensity of that emotion and of all those emotions. And so, yeah, I don't think that stuff changes. But there are, practically speaking, there are a lot, kids are worldlier in all sorts of ways now, much earlier, things that they know without knowing, they know things that we,
didn't know.
didn't know.
And in your book too, it seemed to me, so thinking about, and I think that you can't help but going back to those relationships in your own, and when they were over, they were over. Like, as adults, you might ease back from relationships, but almost like you have the courage, in a way, to say, okay, this is done. You are dead to me.
I know.
You know what I mean? It's so intense and so...
Wendy Leavitt, I know.
Yeah, and also how they go in different directions, because unfortunately I was more like Cassie. So I had a lot of empathy for her, and I have a feeling, for me, it's like growing up with three brothers. You had to be a risk taker. You had to be tough and hang out and go and not be shy and all of those things. So I was always rooting for Cassie. But I had friends, right, that after a while, it's almost like, and the parents say, well, that one's a wild one.
Right.
She's trouble.
Right, yeah, she's trouble. I would rather you didn't sleep over her house.
I don't know if there'll be any grown-ups there.
Yeah, right. If you weren't, and I think I've asked this of you before, I want to see if it's changed, Alice. If you weren't a writer, what would you be?
I don't know. That's such a different life.
So pick it.
But I'd be the manager of whatever it was.
You would still be the boss lady.
Yeah, because I think creating the world, you're kind of the boss as a novelist.
Right.
You create the world. I mean, eventually, an editor might tell you something, but basically, you're in charge of things. And
you like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I have a friend who's a filmmaker. And it seems this wonderful, but it's for one thing, it's like getting the Hindenburg off the ground, and for another, everybody feels like they have a say. They're like, I'm giving you $1 million. Let me tell you what you're going to do.
Right.
Or I'm starring in your movie. Let me tell you what I'm going to do. And I feel like being a writer, it's yours. Yeah, I mean, obviously they're editors, and I know,
Yeah.
but
No, I mean, I was a screenwriter for 25 years in Hollywood, and I worked for those people who told me what to do.
Yeah.
At one point, this is so horrible, don't tell anybody this, but
All right, everyone, it's a secret.
I worked for Cher for many years, and I was getting notes from her boyfriend, who was like the pizza guy. Do you remember that? You remember Rob Camilletti was giving me notes, and I took them.
From the
what could I
pizza
do?
guy?
Sure. They weren't that bad, actually.
I want to know what you got from the pizza guy, but we can talk about that later. Claire, you're a teacher as well. Can you teach writing?
of course not.
Okay.
But you can teach reading. You really
Okay.
can teach reading. And I think, as a teacher, what I try to, for one thing, we read a bunch of, published writers as part of the class, but it's also in what I'm trying to teach the students to do in terms of criticism or like critiques of their fellow students' work is really just to say to the writer what's on the page. Because I think one of the things that can be hard when you write, so you have a vision in your head, and then there's a funnel from that vision onto the page, right? And you might have some idea that pretty much everything in your head is on the page, not always so, right? And I think that for people who are starting out writing, the most useful thing you can give them is not like, I like this, or I don't like this, or I think this is great. Like, that's not that helpful. But just to say what's there. And then they say, so that there are conversations where one student will say, and that at the end when the old lady dies and somebody else says, the old lady died? I didn't think the old lady was dead, right? And that's actually really useful for the writer to hear. That's more useful than I loved it.
Right. And do you ever use your books, or, no, I wouldn't think so. I was just going, how bold is she? Would she, yeah. I think that it's so interesting because I think that the characters, obviously, women writers write really strong characters. The woman upstairs, I haven't read it, but I'm dying to because I love what she wanted to have on her tombstone. What was that?
F you all, I think, was it?
I thought that was so good. Right? Like, you know, great mother, great daughter, great this, and hers was F you all. I just thought that was, yeah. Because she felt that her voice, because people assumed that she hadn't had a life, and then she had that fantasy relationship with someone, and she felt misunderstood.
Well, I think one of the things, when I was working on that novel, which is about it's about an elementary school teacher who always wanted to be an artist, and she always wanted to have kids. So she's a teacher, so she has kids in a way, and she makes art at home, but then she befriends a woman who's like getting on in the art world and is sort of recognized as an artist, and it's about, you know, all of the emotions around that. And the first time, when I was still working on it, I read it we were doing a year in Germany that I mentioned before, and I read it there, and this guy came up to me afterwards, a sort of quite austere Dutchman, you know, older Dutchman, and he said, you know, thank you for reading, it was this sort of ranty bit at the beginning of the book, and he said, thank you for reading that. He said, it reminded me so much of my youth. When I was a kid, on Saturdays, our family would have breakfast, and then my brothers and my father and I would stay, and my mother would go upstairs and clean the upstairs while we stayed in the kitchen, and we would hear her swearing at the top of her lungs as she was, you know, we'd just hear her shouting, and then she'd come down smiling, and we'd never speak about it, right? And I actually think that's you know, I remember my mother yelling at the laundry, right? Like, right. I think that women's anger, that sense, you know, hopefully less now, but historically, women weren't supposed to be angry, and they had a lot to be angry about. Right. So they're how are you gonna let it come out? And the untold stories, I mean, that was not part of any kind of public narrative. And it was interesting for me, the reception of that book, that there were people who came up and said, I love that book and it really spoke to me. And then there were people who said, I hate that book. Why did you write that terrible character? She's no example to anyone, you know. And
then you know it's good. Yeah.
But it was really interesting. I feel like, you know, I felt like it was actually a sort of moratorium on, or is that what I mean? On women's anger. Like it was you know, like.
And didn't your own mother, was she in law school and?
She did, she had.
And she gave it up?
She gave it up. Yeah.
And resented that?
She did.
Yeah.
She did, yeah. She was of an age, I think this, you know, she was born in 33. And she was of an age to be just a little too old for, you know, I mean, I guess if she was a little younger than Betty Friedan, but she was older than Germaine Greer. Like, right. I mean, you know, so she was just a little too old for it to be easy. And well, that said, my parents' first date, they met at a summer school at Oxford, and their first date was a double date with Gloria Steinem and her date. Yeah.
Wow.
And I always said, Mom, you should write to, she wouldn't remember me. But so that's the generation, that was her generation. But I think that, you know, she bought into the whole thing, and she would have had to chuck it all over. And she, you know, it was just I think if you were born 10 years later, it was just a lot easier.
Yeah, a whole different life.
Yeah.
A whole different life. I think we're going to open it up. Do we have time to open? We have 5. Because I could do this. We could be here for, you know, till next Saturday. Does anybody have any questions for? Sure.
Well, I have to say that I've always hated to be read to. So,
what do both Claire and Alice feel about ebooks, books on tape, and as opposed to the physical book?
yeah. So I've never listened to a book on tape. I've listened to one of mine once because Judith Light, who's a friend, was reading it, and she's so great, I wanted to hear her. But I don't read ebooks because I have nothing against them for other people, but it seems like I'm on a computer. Why would I want to do that? I want to be with a book in bed, or it just seems. I personally have no interest in it, but I think it's great if you're traveling or whatever. But it's not for me.
Claire?
I sort of do like being read to, but it's a different experience than reading it yourself. But I also I'm big at the moment into that we're animals, and as animals, sensual things are really important to us, and I worry that we're not imparting that to our kids. And when I was young, I didn't just love reading books. I loved the paper. I remember I loved the end papers, the typeface, and when the smell. Like when I was a kid, when I had one of my first books, and I remember saying, could I have deckled edges on the, and being like so excited. They're like, sure, you can have that. I was like, oh, and I'm like, you're just not going to get that with a Kindle or an ebook.
Yeah. Anybody else? Question?
Alice, I was so struck about how you spoke about your grandmother being such a holding environment for you and this stable, nurturing presence. And then you spoke about this pressure to write how amazingly prolific you are. And it made me think about, at some point, did you become your grandmother? And
I think yesterday. Did I become my grandmother?
And did we, the readers, become you as a child waiting, being held by your books and your writing? So many of them were waiting for the next one, that story.
Well, I love that image. Thank you. It's a beautiful image. Maybe it's true. I hope it's true. That sounds great. I mean, I feel like I could never, I could never be like her. I wish I could be like her. She was just so incredibly real and fierce. So I don't feel like I could ever be like her, but thank you if you think I am.
So I just got a text message from my daughter, who's a huge fan of yours. She should be your fan as well. And
She will be.
Yeah, she will.
Just get her the book.
She says, holy expletive. Ask her how she achieves a haunting atmosphere and what inspired her to write Blackbird House and Practical Magic. Also, I'd like to know her writing process.
She's so cute.
She wants to know your writing process. Do you listen to music, set a tone? What happens? Ask her how she does character development.
She's a riot.
She's hardcore, okay? Does she have any plans to write about more spells or witches?
Wow. Well, that's a lot.
That was like a 5-part.
You better exchange emails.
Yeah, I think I better meet her. Well, I can't even remember how to begin with this, but I really appreciate that email from her, or text, or whatever it is. You're really lucky to have a daughter who's also a reader. That is kind of like the biggest hole in my life, that I never had a daughter. Because for me and my mother, like even when we weren't talking, we shared the same books. And we didn't talk a lot, but we also read a lot. And just in terms of a Blackbird House, I had a house on Cape Cod that was haunted. And, they didn't even show it to anybody because it was so haunted, but what the hell? I looked at it, we bought it. And so it's kind of the story. I love Link's short stories, and it's, the story of the house over 300 years. In terms of atmosphere and how you create an atmosphere, it's really hard to describe that because it's kind of magic. You just kind of let yourself go and see what comes through you and what happens. Anyway, thank you to her.
We've been so lucky to get to spend time with the two of you. This has been delightful and a real thrill for me. So.
And thank you, Kate. Thank you.